Hey guys, for most people, the Middle Ages arrive in the imagination with noise. Iron on stone, barking dogs, drunken voices, church bells, cartwheels, and the crowded confusion of a world before modern order. But one of the strangest truths about medieval life is that, at night, silence itself could become one of the most unsettling things a person ever faced. So before we settle in, tell me where you're watching from, and what piece of history you'd like us to explore next. And if you enjoy this kind of thoughtful long-form history, a quiet like is always a lovely way to support the channel. And if you'd like more calm, carefully told history for evenings like this, consider subscribing. Now, to understand why medieval nights could feel so quiet and so unnerving, we have to begin by setting aside a modern assumption. Darkness in the medieval world was not simply the same night we know today with fewer light bulbs. It was a different environment altogether, governed by weaker light, narrower sight, stronger superstition, and a much sharper sense of human vulnerability. One reason modern people often misunderstand the medieval night is that we picture daily life first, and darkness second. In reality, darkness helped organize the whole shape of life. It determined when work stopped, when travel became dangerous, when households withdrew into themselves, when towns seemed to shrink, and when the world beyond the firelight began to feel uncertain again. Medieval people were not constantly terrified, as lazy myths sometimes suggest, but they were practical enough to know that night changed the rules. A road that seemed ordinary at noon could feel exposed after sunset. A familiar yard could become strange. Even a modest sound, heard in deep darkness, could acquire weight. Part of that came down to the simple physical texture of medieval evenings. There was no electric glow leaking under doors, no distant traffic murmuring through the night, no refrigerator hum, no aircraft passing overhead, no steady urban wash of background sound. Once workshops closed, market life ended, and most movement ceased, the sonic world could collapse very quickly. In a village especially, after the final chores were done and animals settled as best they could, there might be stretches of remarkable stillness broken only by wind, the shifting of timber, a restless horse, an owl, a cough from behind a wall, or the faint creak of a hanging sign. That quiet was real. It was not romantic silence, but an uneven, living stillness, with every small interruption made sharper by the lack of constant noise around it. In towns and cities, the situation was more complicated, but not necessarily less unsettling. Medieval urban places were noisy by day, often intolerably so. Streets were crowded with animals, refuse, commerce, quarrels, craft labor, and the endless friction of people living close together. Yet the contrast with night may have made the after-hours hush feel more dramatic. Gates closed, movement slowed, fires burned lower, households withdrew. The street, which had belonged to everybody in daylight, began to feel like a place one crossed only for a reason. The silence of a town at night was not perfect, but it was tense. It felt watched over and abandoned at the same time. And that is one of the important contradictions of medieval night. It could be quiet not because nothing existed, but because almost everything living was trying, very sensibly, to stay inside. The silence was partly social discipline. There were often rules about curfew, about open flames, about movement, about disorder after dark. Authorities had practical reasons for this. Night increased the risk of theft, assault, fire, and confusion. In many places, bells or official signals marked the shutting down of public life. The point was not only moral control, though morality was certainly part of it. It was also risk management in a world where one accident, one brawl, or one unattended spark could do far more damage than most modern people ever have to imagine. The danger of fire, especially, shaped the medieval night in profound ways. A medieval home was filled with vulnerable materials. Timber frames, thatch in many regions, rushes, straw, cloth, dried goods, smoke-darkened beams, open hearths, candles, embers carried from place to place. After dark, when visibility worsened and tired people made mistakes, the entire settlement became more fragile. Silence, then, had a practical function. Noise meant activity, activity meant movement, movement meant flame, drink, carelessness, and risk. A quiet night was, in some sense, a safer night. Yet the very stillness that protected the town also reminded each household how thin that protection really was. Inside the home, darkness was not completely defeated. This is another modern misunderstanding. Even with candles, oil lamps, or the glow of the hearth, interior light remained local and weak, pooled rather than filled. Corners of a room could remain obscure. Ceilings vanished into shadow. Doorways were uncertain. If a family had only modest means, they would be careful with fuel and candles, and many were. Light cost money, labor, and resources. This meant night was not brightly experienced indoors. It was negotiated. A person moved through pockets of visibility. Beyond that small circle of light, the rest of the house might feel much larger, emptier, or more ambiguous than it did by day. That ambiguity mattered because medieval people lived closer than we do to a world interpreted through both religion and folklore. It is too simple to say that they thought every noise was a demon. Most did not. They knew perfectly well the ordinary sounds of weather, animals, and old buildings settling into colder air. But it is equally wrong to imagine that the unseen held no imaginative force. The night was the natural home of anxiety partly because so much could not be checked immediately. If you heard movement outside, you could not simply switch on a light and inspect the yard. If something knocked in the dark, you first had to decide whether it was wind, animal, stranger, spirit, or your own tired mind rearranging fear into meaning. This is where medieval quiet became psychologically powerful. Silence does not remove fear. Often it enlarges it. In a noisy environment, the mind has less room to seize on one sound. In a quiet one, the smallest irregularity stands alone. A branch striking wood, footsteps where none should be, the low stirring of livestock, a latch shifting in wind. These sounds could be measured against little else, which made them feel nearer, more personal, more intentional. Medieval people did not need to be unusually superstitious for that effect to work. They only needed to be human. Sleeping arrangements added another layer. Many people did not sleep alone in private rooms, as modern viewers often unconsciously assume. Households were crowded. Servants, children, relatives, and laborers might share enclosed space. Beds themselves were precious. Sleep could be segmented, and the night was often interrupted. People woke. They prayed, checked fires, relieved themselves, listened, spoke quietly, or simply lay still. That means medieval nights were not always a single block of unconsciousness. They could include intervals of wakefulness in which the silence of the outside world was freshly felt. To wake in darkness, in a room of breathing bodies, and hear something beyond the wall was not a rare dramatic event. It was part of the texture of life. And yet the quiet was not only frightening, could also feel sacred. This is one of the deeper truths hiding beneath the discomfort. The same silence that made night unsettling also made it spiritually charged. Monastic communities, for instance, used the night differently from villagers or townspeople. For monks and nuns, darkness and silence were not merely endured. They could be cultivated. Night offices, prayer vigils, and disciplined quiet gave darkness structure. In that setting, silence was not empty but purposeful. It drew attention inward and upward. The absence of worldly noise created a setting for devotion, reflection, and memory. But even here there was tension. The monastic night was not cozy. It demanded discipline precisely because darkness could unsettle the mind. Solitude, dim corridors, cold stone, broken sleep, and the awareness of mortality were all part of the religious experience. Medieval Christianity did not always soften the night. Sometimes it deepened its seriousness. The dark reminded people of judgment, temptation, weakness, death, and the limits of worldly control. So even the more orderly, sacred version of medieval silence retained an edge. Outside monasteries, ordinary laypeople also moved through a world in which the night had moral as well as physical associations. Many dangers were materially real. Robbers, wandering animals, bad roads, hidden ditches, drunken violence. But the night also gathered symbolic meaning. Wrongdoing belonged there. So did secrecy. So did temptation. That did not mean night was evil in itself, but it was a time when protection seemed thinner. In daylight, the community was visible. At night, it existed mostly as memory, walls, and trust. You hoped your neighbors were present, even when you could no longer see them. That may be one of the most unsettling things for a modern listener to imagine. Medieval quiet was rarely the silence of total isolation, yet it often felt like standing at the edge of it. People were nearby, but unseen. Help might exist, but not instantly. Danger might be real, but impossible to identify. In that sense, the medieval night revealed something fundamental about pre-modern life. Not constant chaos, but constant exposure. Human beings could build walls, light fires, say prayers, impose curfews, and memorize the habits of the seasons. Even so, once darkness fully settled, the world beyond the threshold remained only partly under human command. And the more carefully people tried to control the night, the more noticeable its mysteries became. A bell marking curfew did not abolish fear. It gave fear a schedule. A barred door did not remove the unknown. It defined its location as outside. Candle did not conquer darkness. It only demonstrated how much darkness remained. So when we think about why medieval nights were so quiet, the answer is not simply that there were fewer machines, fewer people, or fewer distractions. It is that the entire rhythm of life withdrew after sunset, and with that withdrawal came a strange double feeling. Safety inside, uncertainty beyond. Communal order within the walls, vulnerability outside them. Rest, but never complete ease. The quiet was not empty. It was full of caution, habit, faith, memory, and imagination. And once we begin to see that, a deeper question starts to emerge. If the silence of medieval night felt so powerful inside villages, towns, and cloisters, then what did darkness mean on the road itself, beyond the last house, beyond the last watched gate, where even those fragile signs of human order began to fall away into open land and unlit distance? Beyond the last house, beyond the last watched gate, the medieval road at night became a different kind of problem altogether. In daylight, even a poor road still belonged to a recognizable world. You could read it by landmarks, by hedges, by ruts, by shrines, by the outline of a mill, a church tower, or a familiar stand of trees. You could ask directions. You could judge the weather with some confidence. You could see whether the figure ahead was a farmer, a merchant, a pilgrim, or someone best avoided. But after sunset, much of that ordinary legibility disappeared. The land did not merely grow darker. It became harder to interpret, and that loss of interpretation may have been more disturbing than darkness itself. A road at night was seldom silent in an absolute sense. Wind moved through brush. Water ran unseen in ditches or streams. Horses breathed and stamped. Leather creaked. Harness rings knocked softly against wood or metal. Yet those were intimate sounds, close sounds, enclosed sounds. They did not make the world feel inhabited in a reassuring way. They only reminded the traveler how small his own pool of awareness had become. The further one moved from settled space, The less the night seemed like an interval in daily life, and the more it resembled a condition of uncertainty into which one had entered almost by mistake. This helps explain why medieval travel was so often planned conservatively. Modern people sometimes imagine the pre-modern traveler as endlessly wandering through wild landscapes with cheerful resilience, but most journeys were shaped by caution, daylight, weather, and local knowledge. Traveling after dark was not impossible, and in some situations it was unavoidable, but it was rarely preferred. The reason was not only fear of criminals, although robbery certainly mattered. It was also the cumulative danger of small misjudgments. A horse could stumble, cart axle could fail, a bridge could be missed, a track could fork without warning. A marshy patch could look solid until it was not. A man who lost the road entirely might not face a dramatic cinematic disaster, but he could face something more medieval and more common. Cold, delay, exposure, injury, confusion, and a long wait for dawn. That is one of the quiet truths beneath medieval night. Much of what made it unsettling was not theatrical terror, but the practical awareness that things could go wrong slowly, without witness, and without quick remedy. If a modern driver breaks down on a rural road, there is still some expectation of signal, assistance, or the eventual passage of others. Medieval people lived with much thinner margins. To be delayed in darkness was to feel time itself behave differently. Every hour until dawn might be occupied not with action, but with endurance. And endurance in darkness sharpened the senses in an uncomfortable way. If you stopped moving, the silence could feel heavier than motion. If you continued, each sound you made announced you to whatever else might be near. This is why even the simplest signs of human habitation could become deeply reassuring at night. A light at a distance, however dim, was not merely a light. It was shelter, direction, judgment, and the return of meaning. A dog barking from a farmstead might be annoying by day, but in darkness it could be strangely comforting. It proved that people were near, and that the world had boundaries again. Inns therefore occupied an important place in the medieval imagination, not only as commercial stops but as islands of recognizable order in a dangerous interval between destinations. Of course, inns varied enormously. Some were respectable and busy. Some were rough, expensive, dirty, or outright suspect. But even a poor inn represented walls, fire, food of some sort, other human beings, and the possibility of sleeping under something more secure than the sky. The road at night made people less romantic and more grateful. Privacy mattered less than enclosure. Comfort mattered less than not being outside. Yet even the inn did not always dissolve the unease of the medieval night. Shared rooms, unfamiliar strangers, uncertain locks, lice, stale air, rough bedding, drunken talk in a lower room, and the creaking of old timbers could make safety feel provisional. In this way, the medieval night often worked through layers rather than opposites. One was safer indoors than out, but not perfectly safe. One was better within walls than on the road, but walls themselves had degrees of trust. A town was better than open country, a known household better than an inn, one's own bed better than any lodging. But even at home, darkness still had reach. That layered sense of security also shaped social behavior. Households closed themselves in with routines that were repetitive precisely because repetition reduced uncertainty. Doors were barred. Fires were banked. Animals were checked. Tools were put away. Water might be drawn in advance to avoid venturing out. Chamber pots replaced night journeys where possible. Prayers were said. Candles were extinguished carefully. These actions were not quaint rituals. They were practical techniques for shrinking vulnerability. Each small task was a way of deciding before full darkness what kind of night one hoped to have. And in many homes, especially poorer ones, the boundary between human and animal life made nighttime even more textured. Animals were not always remote from domestic space. Their sounds entered the night at close range. A tethered beast shifting in straw, a pig stirring, chickens disturbed by some unseen movement, a horse snorting sharply in a stable. All of these noises could ripple into a household's sleep. To us, this might sound like ordinary background life, but in a quieter acoustic world, each disruption mattered more. If animals became restless together, people noticed. Sometimes there was a clear cause. Sometimes there was not. Either way, the household might wake into that old medieval dilemma. Is this a harmless disturbance, or the first sign of trouble? This question mattered because the medieval household was never as sealed as a modern one. Walls admitted drafts, sound, moisture, and sometimes vermin. Roofs could fail. Floors could shift. Doors and shutters offered protection, but not complete insulation from the outside world. Winter nights brought their own discomforts of cold, contraction, and strange noises in timber. Summer brought a different set of irritations. Insects, heat, smells, and the easier movement of people outdoors before full sleep. Storm nights were a category unto themselves. Thunder and wind could transform the atmosphere entirely, turning quiet expectation into noisy fear. But interestingly, storm nights were not always the most unnerving. A storm explained itself. A still night did not. A still night left room for interpretation, and medieval people, like all people, interpreted through the mental furniture available to them. That furniture included saints, devils, ghosts, omens, the restless dead, local legends, divine warnings, and inherited cautionary tales about what moved abroad after dark. Some of these beliefs were deeply held, others only half believed, others repeated because they were culturally available and emotionally useful. What matters is not whether every villager literally expected supernatural encounters. What matters is that the night provided a setting in which uncertainty could borrow these forms. The human mind dislikes formlessness. If it hears something it cannot place, it reaches for known shapes. And medieval culture offered many such shapes. There were tales of churchyards, crossroads, lonely paths, ruined places, woods, moors, and watersides charged with a special unease. These settings appear again and again in folklore because they combine two powerful features. They are real places, and they are places where ordinary social order weakens. A crossroads is not frightening because roads meet there. It is frightening because choices meet there, strangers meet there, jurisdictions blur there. A wood is not simply dark. It is difficult to supervise. A churchyard is not merely a burial site. It is a place where the living and the remembered dead are held close together. The medieval night did not invent these meanings, but it intensified them. This is where silence becomes more than an absence of sound and starts to function almost like a medium. In silence, meanings travel farther. A listener alone in darkness can move very quickly from hearing to imagining, from imagining to interpreting, and from interpreting to believing that action must be taken. A man hears movement near his yard and rises to check the animals. A woman wakes to a persistent scratching and wonders whether it is a branch, a rat, or someone testing a shutter. A servant sent outside with a lantern sees only the few feet the flame can hold back, and beyond that, the rest of the world remains unwitnessed. In such moments, quiet does not soothe. It narrows the universe to a fragile exchange between what can be sensed and what cannot. The quality of medieval light made this exchange even more difficult. We tend to think of firelight as warm and charming because we encounter it by choice, in safe rooms, for limited periods. But medieval illumination was often smoky, unstable, expensive, and physically weak. Candles guttered. Oil lamps needed fuel. Torches were clumsy and not always practical indoors. firelight threw shadows as much as it removed them. A person carrying a light at night also altered his own vision, creating a bright foreground and a darker beyond. The eye, adjusted to flame, lost the subtle gradients that moonlight might otherwise reveal. In a curious way, bringing light into darkness did not always make things clearer. It often made the boundary of the unknown more sharply visible. Moonlight helped, of course, but not reliably. A bright moon could transform a road, a field, or a churchyard into something pale and legible enough for movement. Yet moonlight had its own strangeness. It flattened depth, distorted distance, and made familiar forms appear unfamiliar. A stump became a crouched figure. Laundry or cloth stirred into life. Frost gleamed where water was expected. A stand of trees became a wall. Medieval people did not need ghost stories to find moonlit landscapes unsettling. Vision itself behaved differently there. The world seemed available, but only partly, as though one had been allowed to see its outline without being trusted with its detail. And then there were the bells. Church bells, town bells, curfew bells, bells for warning, bells for prayer, bells marking time in a world that otherwise lost definition after dark. The sound of a bell at night could be stabilizing because it came from somewhere known and carried social meaning across distance. It reminded listeners that authority, worship, and communal rhythm still existed in darkness. But bells could also heighten awareness of the silence surrounding them. Once their sound faded, the quiet afterward often felt deeper. It is one of those paradoxes that runs through medieval night again and again. The signs of order were reassuring, yet they also threw the surrounding uncertainty into sharper relief. Monastic communities understood this especially well because they lived by bells through the night. The call to offices divided darkness into meaningful portions. Prayer interrupted sleep. Time was not allowed to dissolve completely into undifferentiated blackness. And yet the very act of rising into cold silence, dressing by dim light, walking passages before dawn, and entering a church where voices emerged from shadow must have given many religious houses a nocturnal atmosphere unlike almost anything in modern life. This was disciplined darkness, but still darkness. It was structured silence, but still silence. One can imagine how powerfully it shaped the mind. The body tired, the senses narrowed, the hour uncertain, the chant steady, the outside world absent and immense. For lay people, too, the night had a rhythm, though often a more domestic one. Historians have long noted that pre-modern sleep could be segmented, with an initial sleep followed by a waking interval and then a second sleep. That pattern, while not universal in a simple way, helps explain why night was experienced not as blank oblivion but as a sequence with openings in it. During those waking intervals, silence could be noticed anew. People might tend fires, pray, think, whisper, remember, or worry. Some would lie awake listening to the household breathe. Some would register weather. Some would hear a distant animal or passing step and wonder whether anyone else had heard it too. This may be why the medieval night often seems, in sources and imagination alike, less like a backdrop and more like an active condition of thought. Day encouraged outward attention. Night drew attention inward, not always peacefully. Concerns about debt, illness, travel, harvest, childbirth, sin, reputation, local quarrels, and divine judgment did not disappear in darkness. They often became harder to manage there. Without daylight tasks to distribute the mind, the quiet might carry a person back toward whatever he most feared or most regretted. In that sense, the unsettling character of medieval nights was not only environmental. It was also moral, social, and deeply personal. And this is where another modern assumption begins to soften. We often imagine that what frightened medieval people at night was mainly the supernatural. In truth, The more persistent unease may have come from the overlap between the ordinary and the unknowable. A thief was more frightening because he was plausible. Fire was more frightening because it was common. Illness was more frightening because help was limited. A cry in the night mattered not because it proved a ghost, but because it might prove a neighbor in distress, an animal loose, or some small disaster already unfolding. The supernatural did not replace ordinary fear. It lived alongside it, giving shape to the edges of a world already difficult enough. That difficulty also varied by season. Winter nights were long enough to feel almost architectural, as though darkness itself had more rooms inside it. People entered them earlier and remained within them longer. Fuel had to last. Food stores mattered more. The poor suffered sharply. Sounds carried differently in cold air. Frost and snow could brighten the ground but also deepen isolation. Summer nights, by contrast, might keep traces of social life outdoors longer, especially during labor-heavy seasons when daylight was precious and sleep was shaped by exhaustion rather than leisure. Yet even summer had its vulnerable hours, especially once fires diminished and the final voices ceased, leaving fields and lanes under a softer but no less ambiguous dark. And for those on the margins of society, the night could mean something harsher still. The homeless, the displaced, fugitives, night watchmen, messengers, patrols, sailors approaching unfamiliar shorelines, women in labor, healers summoned urgently, priests called to the dying. All of them encountered darkness not as a philosophical atmosphere but as a working condition. Their nights were often broken, uncomfortable, and full of practical strain. This matters because it reminds us that medieval silence was not evenly distributed. For some, night meant uneasy shelter. For others, it meant obligation. For a few, it meant opportunity. Because darkness did not merely frighten, it also concealed. And once concealment enters the story, the medieval night begins to reveal another side of itself, one less passive, less inward, and more contested. The same silence that made households pull closer together could offer cover to smugglers, thieves, illicit lovers, secret meetings, political schemes, and small acts of survival that daylight authority might have interrupted. Night was not only when society retreated. It was also when some people moved precisely because society had retreated, and that tension between silence and hidden activity begins to change the way the whole medieval world looks after sunset. Night was not only when society retreated. It was also when some people moved precisely because society had retreated, and that tension between silence and hidden activity begins to change the way the whole medieval world looks after sunset. If we slow down and look more carefully, the medieval night starts to feel less like a single experience and more like a negotiation between those trying to preserve order and those willing, or forced, to operate beyond it. This is one of the reasons the silence could feel so unsettling. Quiet did not necessarily mean inactivity. On the contrary, it often meant that whatever was happening could not be easily seen, named, or controlled. A lane could appear empty and still conceal footsteps. A riverside might seem deserted while small cargoes were being moved. A sleeping household might imagine that the world outside had gone still, while somewhere beyond the nearest hedge or wall, other people were taking advantage of the hour. For local authorities, this was an old and familiar problem. Medieval towns did not impose curfews, watches, and gate closures simply out of habit or vague moral preference. These were answers to a real difficulty. Darkness thinned visibility faster than it thinned human intention. In daylight, conduct could be observed and corrected through presence alone. Merchants traded in public. Disputes unfolded before witnesses. Strangers could be questioned. Animals, carts, and bodies moved through a landscape of shared sight. At night, that informal network of observation weakened. Even if a town had walls, gates, officers, and neighbors who knew one another, darkness created gaps in supervision. The silence of night was therefore not always a sign of peace. Sometimes it was a sign that power itself had become less immediate. This is why the office of the night watch mattered so much. In theory, the watch stood between communal rest and nocturnal disorder. In practice, the job could be thankless, cold, dangerous, and not always performed with the heroic vigilance that later imagination likes to supply. Watchmen were human. They grew tired. They grew bored. They sheltered from weather. They missed things. Some were conscientious, some indifferent, some corruptible, and some simply unequipped to master the darkness they were meant to patrol. But their very existence tells us something important. Medieval communities understood that night required active management. The quiet did not maintain itself. It had to be listened to, walked through, challenged, and interpreted by men who were expected to decide whether a sound was harmless, suspicious, or urgent. And that task was rarely straightforward. Imagine walking a dark street with a lantern, hearing movement beyond your light. To investigate too boldly could mean stepping into danger. To ignore it could mean negligence. To call out and receive no answer might be reassuring, or it might be worse. Even an honest watchman could never fully dissolve the ambiguity of the hour. He could only stand inside it a little longer than others, acting as the community's uneasy ears. The sounds of the watch themselves formed part of the medieval soundscape. Footsteps on packed earth or stone, the strike of a staff, a challenge into the dark, perhaps the call of the hour in some places, the occasional rattle of equipment or exchange between patrolmen. These were not loud by modern standards, but they punctured silence with signs of order. To hear the watch pass could be comforting, though perhaps also faintly unnerving, because it reminded listeners why the watch was needed at all. If men were still moving through the streets with lights and weapons, then the night remained a space of possible interruption. Yet not all nighttime movement was criminal, and this is where the world becomes more textured. People traveled at night for reasons that were not only desperate or illicit. Urgent business, medical need, religious devotion, weather conditions, tidal schedules, long-distance trade, and sheer necessity all forced movement beyond daylight. Fishermen, ferrymen, messengers, bakers, brewers, servants, shepherds, and laborers tied to seasonal rhythms sometimes inhabited hours that more comfortable households associated with sleep. Their relationship to medieval quiet was different. For them, night was not merely a time feared from behind shutters. It was also a working environment, one that demanded familiarity with dimness, fatigue, and uncertainty. Bakers offer a particularly revealing example. In many towns, baking began well before dawn so that bread could be ready for the day's trade. That meant ovens were lit while much of the town still slept. Flour moved in darkness. Fires were coaxed into life. Work began in a period that belonged neither fully to night nor fully to morning. This complicates the old image of a medieval town falling wholly silent after sunset and remaining dormant until dawn. Some forms of labor slipped into the dark margins of the day precisely because urban life depended on them. But that only sharpens the contrast. The worker awake before dawn would move through a town that was not dead, but suspended, and that suspension could make every sound seem more distinct than it would later. The same was true at ports and along rivers. Water has its own night language, and medieval people knew it intimately. Oars dipping, hulls shifting, ropes straining, the slap of current against timber, the distant call from a quay, the groan of moored vessels moving with tide and wind. These sounds could travel far in darkness. A harbor or riverside at night was seldom silent in the way an inland field might be, but its noise often deepened rather than relieved the uncertainty of the hour. One could hear activity without clearly seeing it. One could sense labor, movement, and commerce continuing beyond the edge of vision. For a sleepless listener near the water, that might be oddly reassuring. Or it might make the night feel larger, less containable, full of business one could detect but not verify. There is also a social irony here. Medieval elites often had more substantial buildings, thicker walls, servants, guarded precincts, and better access to candlelight than ordinary people. In one sense, they could buy a measure of protection from the night. But rank did not exempt them from nocturnal vulnerability. Castles, manor houses, and urban residences still depended on human watchfulness. Gates had to be guarded, fires managed, messages delivered, disturbances answered. A noble household might fear intrusion less than a poor cottage did, but it also had more to defend, more internal movement, more servants and dependents, more political enemies, and more reasons to remain alert. The quiet around wealth was therefore not necessarily peaceful, could be charged with precaution. Inside great households, night was often organized through hierarchy. Servants banked fires, secured doors, prepared chambers, checked animals, and remained available should masters need them. This meant that even sleep itself was socially structured. Some people rested more deeply because others remained partially awake. The silence of privilege, in that sense, was supported by labor. A lord might hear only muffled sounds beyond curtains and stone, while someone below stairs heard the building differently. A draft in the corridor, a late arrival, the shifting of stores, the creak of beams, the movement of guards at the gate. Medieval quiet was not uniform across a household. It depended on where one slept, what one feared, and whether one's role was to rest or to remain ready. That unequal experience of darkness appears again when we think about women's lives. The medieval night was not gender-neutral. Expectations around movement, safety, reputation, and vulnerability were often different for women, especially in towns where public visibility carried moral consequences. To be abroad after dark could expose a woman not only to physical danger but to suspicion, gossip, or legal difficulty, depending on circumstance and status. Yet women, too, had practical reasons to move at night. Childbirth, domestic labor, urgent caregiving, religious observance, service in large households, and the endless obligations that did not always respect daylight boundaries. This means the quiet night could press differently on different bodies. For some it meant danger from strangers. For others, danger from scandal. For many, a combination of both. Childbirth is especially revealing here, because it shows how quickly medieval silence could break open into intense communal activity. A house that seemed still an hour earlier might suddenly fill with messengers, women attendants, prayers, instructions, water, heat, and fear. The night did not erase community. Sometimes it summoned it in concentrated form. But that concentration also made the hours feel fragile. A difficult labor in darkness, with limited light and limited medicine, turned the quiet of night into something heavy and attentive. People listened differently then. Every sound in the room mattered. Every silence mattered too. The same can be said of illness and death. One of the most unsettling dimensions of medieval night was that serious physical crises often unfolded when help was hardest to get. A fever worsening after dusk, a child struggling to breathe, an injury discovered too late, an old person sinking in the early hours. These were not dramatic exceptions but ordinary possibilities of a world with little medical certainty. Priests might be summoned to hear confession or administer last rites. Neighbors might be called. Relatives might wake to whispers, prayers, footfalls in the passage, and the low, careful activity that attends a house where sleep has ended for everyone at once. Here again, the night was quiet only until something pierced it, and then the contrast between stillness and emergency could feel absolute. That contrast helps explain why sound carried such emotional force. A knock at night was never just a knock. It was an event. It demanded interpretation before the door was opened. Who would come at this hour? What news travels in darkness? Is this summons, trouble, authority, or misfortune? Medieval people lived in a world where the timing of a sound could alter its meaning as much as the sound itself. Bells in daylight, organized. Bells at night warned. Footsteps in daylight belonged to traffic. Footsteps at night approached significance. Even voices were transformed. A shout in darkness did not dissolve into general noise. Cut through everything. And because it cut through everything, people remembered such moments. This matters when we think about how the medieval night entered story, law, and religious imagination. Nighttime incidents stood out because the background was thinner. A theft by day might be one urban problem among many. A theft by night felt more invasive. A cry heard at the wrong hour became worth recounting. A sighting, a rumor, a disturbance, an unexplained noise. All of these took on narrative power more readily in a quiet world. Silence sharpened memory. It made events feel outlined. This may be one reason the medieval period left behind so many records, stories, and anxieties attached to the night without requiring us to believe that every night was full of melodrama. Most nights were probably ordinary in the most human sense. People settled, slept, woke, turned over, worried, prayed, coughed, checked the fire, and saw morning come. But what made the night unsettling was not constant crisis. It was that any interruption stood out against a field of low sound and limited sight, and that interruption had to be interpreted before it could be managed. There is a further irony in all this. We often imagine that more darkness automatically means deeper rest, that a quieter world must have been more soothing. In some ways, yes, medieval people were spared the relentless mechanical noise, artificial glare, and permanent stimulation that exhaust modern minds. Darkness was deeper. The stars, where visible, were vastly more present. The pace of evening could be slower and more natural than ours. But rest is not produced by silence alone. It also depends on security, temperature, comfort, confidence, and the expectation that one can remain asleep without consequence. Those conditions were unevenly available in the medieval world. A quiet night in a cold room, under uncertain roof, with illness nearby, animals stirring, and tomorrow's labor waiting, was not necessarily a gentle experience. And yet human beings adapt. Medieval people were not fragile before the dark. They were practiced in it. They learned the acoustics of their houses, the ordinary movements of animals, the difference between familiar and unfamiliar steps, the weight of weather in the air, the timing of bells, and the habits of neighbors. Children grew up inside these patterns. Adults absorbed them so thoroughly that much of the night's management became instinctive. This is important because it saves us from a false picture of universal dread. What unsettled medieval people was not darkness in the abstract. It was disruption within a darkness they otherwise knew well. That distinction becomes especially useful when we move from private houses and guarded streets to the places where knowledge thinned again. The edge of the forest, the unlit field, the broken ruin outside town, the causeway through marsh, the hill road in bad weather, the abandoned structure half remembered in local talk. These were places where even practiced familiarity could fail, where ordinary domestic knowledge of nighttime sounds gave way to a more exposed kind of listening. The medieval imagination placed many of its fears there not only because such places were symbolically rich, but because they genuinely strained the senses. A listener at home could compare a sound to the known. A traveler near a wood at night often could not. The cry of an animal, the movement of branches, the shifting of unseen creatures in undergrowth, the uncertain depth of the path beneath one's feet. These made the quiet unstable. The world was not silent, but it was silent in the wrong way. Not restful, but withholding. And in places like that, practical danger and imaginative fear began to overlap almost perfectly. One could become lost, robbed, soaked, bitten, thrown, or simply overwhelmed by disorientation. Under those conditions, even the most rational mind starts to borrow older language for what it feels. This is why medieval forests and lonely roads became such durable settings in European storytelling. They were not merely literary decorations. They condensed real pressures. The thinning of community, the weakening of law, the unreliability of vision, the exaggeration of sound, and the sense that outside settled life, the world might still refuse to be fully humanized. A person entering such a place after dark was not only physically vulnerable. He was also leaving behind the social and spiritual architecture that made ordinary life legible. And once that architecture fell away, another question emerged, one that medieval people answered differently depending on place, status, and belief. When silence deepened and the usual signs of order disappeared, what exactly did one rely on then? Walls, memory, prayer, companions, weapons, landmarks, luck, divine protection, or simply the hope that dawn would arrive before whatever was out there came any closer. Or simply the hope that dawn would arrive before whatever was out there came any closer. That hope, quiet and practical as it was, explains a great deal about how medieval people prepared themselves for darkness. They relied first on habit. Habit is one of the least glamorous subjects in history, but it is often the most revealing. A world without abundant artificial light, without rapid communication, and without modern guarantees of rescue taught people to arrange their evenings carefully. The door was barred before full dark if possible, not after. Water, fuel, and tools were set within reach. Animals were accounted for. A traveler tried to reach lodging before sunset rather than test the road by moonlight. A priest called to the dying carried not only the sacred things required by his office, but also the ordinary knowledge of paths, households, and local landmarks that might keep him from stumbling into the wrong field or losing an hour at a fork in the lane. Memory, too, mattered more than we sometimes appreciate. In a dim world, memory substituted for sight long before the eye failed completely. People learned distances by footfall, corners by touch, the sound of particular gates, the slope of certain roads, the smell of a stable yard, the shape of a key in the dark, the number of paces between bed and hearth, hearth and door, door and yard. Medieval quiet was unsettling partly because it exposed what remained uncertain, but it was bearable because so much of life had already been committed to memory. If one knew one's own world intimately enough, the night became less an abyss than a difficult version of the familiar. Still, even familiarity had its limits. Night stripped away redundancy. By day, a person could confirm one sense with another. At night, touch and hearing carried more of the burden, and once they did, judgment grew harder. Was that the mill stream or rain gathering in a ditch? Was that the old dog in the next yard or another animal entirely? Did someone just pass the shutter or did the wind press unevenly against it? This thinning of certainty is one of the most important features of the medieval night, and it helps us avoid a false split between real dangers and imagined fears. In practice, the two lived beside one another. The imagination did not replace practical caution. It simply moved into the spaces where practical caution could not yet resolve what was happening. Prayer therefore belonged naturally to the night, not only because darkness inspired religious feeling, but because prayer served as a form of orientation. In a world where not everything could be checked or controlled, prayer offered order to the mind. It marked the hour. It named fear. It placed uncertainty within a larger structure of meaning. This was true in monasteries, where the night was broken by offices, but it was also true in humble homes where a brief evening prayer, a blessing at bed, or an invocation uttered in fear could make darkness feel less shapeless. Medieval religion did not merely explain the night. It gave people something to do within it, and that practical dimension of belief matters. Modern listeners sometimes imagine pre-modern religion as a soft layer of symbolism floating above daily life. In reality, it was often woven tightly into routines of risk. A blessing over a house, a prayer before a journey, an appeal to a saint in illness, a cross marked against danger. These things were not always signs of abstract theology. They were techniques of living in a world where control was limited and unseen forces, whether natural or supernatural, felt close. The night intensified this because darkness made visible just how much human beings could not master. Companionship worked in a similar way. One person alone at night had to interpret everything privately. 2 or 3 people could distribute uncertainty between them. This is why traveling in company was valued, and why sleeping in shared rooms could be both uncomfortable and reassuring at once. Privacy is often treated as an unquestioned good in modern life, but in the medieval night privacy could shade quickly into exposure. Another breathing body nearby meant witness, warmth, help, and confirmation that a sound had, or had not, truly occurred. If someone else heard it too, the world regained a little firmness. If not, perhaps the mind could be persuaded back toward sleep. There is a quiet human tenderness in that. Much of medieval nighttime life depended on the shared management of vulnerability. Parents listened for children. Servants listened for masters. Neighbors might listen for neighbors in trouble. Even animals were part of the network. A dog barking at the wrong moment could raise a household. A horse's distress could signal movement in a yard before any human eye saw it. Silence, then, was not merely empty space. It was the medium in which relationships of care and alarm operated. The quieter the night, the more clearly those ties could be tested. At the same time, weapons occupied a place in nighttime culture that was both practical and symbolic. A knife, staff, or sword at hand might not guarantee safety, but it represented readiness in a world where one could not assume immediate protection from others. Yet weapons also reveal another truth. They were useful only up to a point. In full darkness, the problem was often not fighting but knowing. To defend oneself, one first had to identify the threat, judge its location, decide whether the sound was truly human, and then act without injuring the wrong person or stepping into greater danger. In that sense, the medieval night humbled violence. It reduced confidence. Even an armed man could be made uncertain by what he could not see. That is part of why the threshold itself became so important. Doors, shutters, gates, walls, hedges, boundary ditches. These were not simply pieces of architecture or agriculture. At night, they were mental as well as physical lines. They separated the known from the less known, the guarded from the exposed, the communal from the uncertain. A barred door was psychologically powerful because it turned the dark into an outside condition. Once shut in, a household could imagine itself gathered together against whatever remained beyond. Yet thresholds were also the places where night announced itself most sharply. Knocking came there, wind pressed there, news arrived there, danger tested them. In a way, the medieval night was lived most intensely not in the center of the room, but at the edges where inside met out. This is why so many nighttime episodes in medieval records and stories begin with a disturbance at a boundary. Someone heard something at the gate. Someone saw a light near the yard. Someone called from outside after dark. Someone failed to return before closing. Someone requested entry at an unusual hour. These were moments when the silence of the night condensed into decision. Open or do not open. Answer or remain still. Trust the voice or distrust it. Send someone to look or wait until dawn. The unsettling quality of medieval nights often lay precisely here. They forced judgment under poor conditions. And poor conditions did not affect everyone equally. The rich could afford more candles, stronger doors, larger households, and better bedding, but they also lived in spaces large enough to produce their own uncertainties. A great house at night could be full of distant sounds whose source was not obvious. Corridors lengthened darkness. Upper chambers removed people from the activity below but also from immediate control over it. A servant might hear one thing in the pantry, a guard another at the gate, someone in the solar something else again, and the building itself, timber, iron, stone, shutters, hearth, contributed its own nocturnal language. Large households, therefore, often contained multiple versions of the same night, depending on whether one slept behind hangings, on a bench near the kitchen, or half awake in duty. For the poor, the problem was different. Their nights could be quieter in one sense because their dwellings were smaller and their resources fewer, but also harsher because cold, damp, hunger, and proximity left little buffer between the body and discomfort. Silence is less restful when one is cold. Darkness is less poetic when the roof leaks. The long winter night in a poor household could stretch not only acoustically, but physically. Time passed slowly because the body remained aware of want. This matters because it reminds us that the medieval night cannot be separated from material conditions. A quiet room was not necessarily a peaceful room. It might simply be a room where people had learned to endure hardship without speaking much. That endurance was often seasonal, and the liturgical year as well as the agricultural year gave night different textures. Winter vigils, Advent observances, the solemnity of certain feast nights, the darkness surrounding Christmas before the return of light, the penitential quiet of Lent, the candlelit strangeness of Easter ceremonies. All of these meant that medieval people experienced some nights not only as practical intervals, but as culturally charged hours. Ritual could transform the night without making it less intense. A candle procession, a midnight mass, a vigil in prayer did not abolish the old uncertainties. Instead, they overlaid them with meaning. The night remained dark, but it was no longer only a field of danger. It became a field of expectation. This is one of the reasons medieval nights resist simple summary. They were not merely terrifying, and they were not merely serene. They contained both possibility and threat, rest and work, holiness and suspicion, intimacy and exposure. A household settled into sleep while elsewhere a monastery rose to chant. A town watch challenged strangers while bakers lit ovens. A traveler hurried toward an inn while a smuggler trusted the same darkness for concealment. A mother listened for a sick child while a priest crossed cold lanes toward a deathbed. The silence linking these experiences was shared, but not identical in meaning. In fact, the very phrase medieval night may hide the degree to which different landscapes produced different kinds of quiet. A dense town did not sound like a fenland path. A coast did not sound like an inland village. A forest margin did not sound like a walled city under curfew. On the coast, waves and wind could make the night feel ceaselessly alive even when human life withdrew. In wetlands, unseen water and bird calls could create a restless acoustic background that blurred direction. In mountainous or hilly regions, echoes could mislead, and weather could change faster than a traveler wished. In woodland, the close darkness of trees reduced even the pale usefulness of moonlight. So when medieval people feared, tolerated, or even cherished the night, they were also responding to specific terrains, not an abstract darkness. Terrain shaped law as well. A town could try to regulate noise, light, and movement after dark, but open country obeyed no curfew bell in the same way. Their protection depended more heavily on local ties, private caution, and the reputation of routes. Certain roads were known to be bad in weather, dangerous after dusk, or avoided except in company. Certain river crossings were dreaded. Certain stretches of wood or heath acquired reputations that mixed real incidents with rumor until it scarcely mattered where fact ended and story began. A road once associated with robbery did not need a fresh crime every month to remain frightening after sunset. Memory did part of the work. Silence did the rest. This helps explain the durability of nighttime rumor. In quiet conditions, stories attach themselves to places with unusual force. If one hears that a lane is haunted, dangerous, or unlucky, then every later uncertainty on that lane becomes easier to interpret through that frame. Medieval people were not uniquely gullible in this regard. We still do the same with places that carry reputations, only our lighting and infrastructure conceal how quickly the mind can cooperate with atmosphere. In the medieval world, atmosphere had more room. There were fewer competing signals to overwhelm it. Yet we should be careful not to mistake this for pure irrationality. Often the supposedly eerie place was eerie for a reason. A bend in the road might conceal ambush. A ruined structure might shelter undesired company. A marsh path might swallow carts in bad weather. A crossing associated with ghosts might first have been associated with drownings. In other words, what sounded like superstition could preserve practical warning in symbolic form. The supernatural language came later or alongside, but the danger beneath it remained real enough. This is one of the most revealing reversals in the whole subject. What modern people dismiss as medieval fearfulness often contains a hard kernel of environmental intelligence. And once we notice that, the silence of the medieval night begins to seem not merely ominous but informative. It taught listeners to discriminate, to notice, to compare one unusual sound against 1,000 ordinary ones. A household that survived many winters, many lambing seasons, many illnesses, many absences, many rumors, and many ordinary nights did so partly because someone kept listening well. Sleep in the Middle Ages was not always to surrender consciousness completely to safety. It was often to rest inside a thinner, more alert relationship with the world. That alertness is perhaps what makes the subject feel so intimate even now. We can imagine grand battles, coronations, or cathedrals from a distance. But the sound of a latch in darkness, the unease of hearing wind move where no wind should be, the relief of a bell from a known tower, the feeling of waiting for dawn when one would rather not be awake. These are easy bridges between past and present. The medieval night was strange, certainly, but it was also humanly recognizable. It exposed the body, the imagination, and the household in ways that modern infrastructure usually softens for us. That is why it remains compelling. It shows a world less insulated, and therefore more revealing. And perhaps nowhere was that revelation sharper than in the narrow hours before dawn. When the first sleep had long passed, the second sleep had not yet fully settled, fires burned low, the cold deepened in many seasons, and even the most familiar house could feel suspended between exhaustion and expectation. Those pre-dawn hours carried their own special atmosphere, and medieval people knew them well enough to give them a weight that was different from both midnight and morning. Those pre-dawn hours carried their own special atmosphere, and medieval people knew them well enough to give them a weight that was different from both midnight and morning. Midnight, in imagination at least, could seem dramatic. It was the deep center of darkness, the symbolic hour of danger, secrecy, temptation, and interruption. But the hours before dawn were often stranger in a quieter way. They lacked the sharp theatricality later culture likes to attach to midnight. Instead, they carried fatigue, cold, uncertainty, and a lingering sense that the night had gone on long enough. A person waking then might not feel startled so much as suspended. The house was still there, the same walls, the same hearth, the same sleeping forms nearby, and yet everything felt thinned out. The fire was lower, the body was stiffer, the silence had lasted for hours, which gave it a depth that evening never possessed. That depth mattered because it altered how time was felt. In the early evening, darkness had only just arrived, and the household still carried the warmth and momentum of the day. Tools had recently been put aside. Voices had only recently dropped. Supper, prayer, and the settling of bodies into beds gave the first part of the night a shape that belonged to action. But before dawn, those structures had loosened. The tasks were done. The mind had already passed through one interval of sleep or wakefulness. Even fear felt different then, less sudden and more cumulative. If something troubled a household in those hours, it could seem heavier precisely because everyone was already worn down by the long stretch of darkness behind them. This may be why pre-dawn sounds could feel especially intrusive. The same creak in the first hour of sleep might be dismissed. Toward dawn, heard after a night of half-rest and recurrent waking, it could seem more deliberate. A knock at that hour carried a special urgency. Who comes then unless the news is serious, the road unavoidable, or the need immediate? Even animals, when they moved in those hours, could sound more consequential. A cock crowing early might reassure one listener and irritate another. A dog suddenly alert before first light could cause unease, because it suggested the world outside had begun to stir before the household was ready to face it. And yet pre-dawn was also the moment when night's authority started to weaken. This is one of the subtle but important reversals in medieval experience. The darkest emotional weight of the night did not always correspond to its darkest visual point. Sometimes the blackest sky belonged to midnight, while the most unsettling inward feeling belonged to the hour just before relief. At that point, listeners knew morning would come, but had not yet received it. The promise of dawn was close enough to be imagined and still far enough to be absent. Hope can make waiting more difficult. A person enduring cold or anxiety at midnight could resign himself to a long night. A person enduring it just before dawn might feel the delay more sharply because the end seemed near. That strange mixture of endurance and expectation helps explain why so much labor also gathered around the edge of dawn. Medieval life did not wake all at once. It began to rise in layers. Somewhere, before the sky had fully changed, a servant was already stirring ashes, coaxing embers back into flame, and moving through a room that still belonged to the night acoustically even if morning had begun socially. In another building, monks or canons were assembling for the office that drew the last darkness into prayer. Elsewhere, a baker or brewer was preparing for the day's work, moving through familiar motions with hands that knew what the eyes only half saw. The village or town was not yet awake, but neither was it fully asleep. It was shifting. That shift had its own soundscape, and it was very different from both day and night. The first sounds of waking life emerged into a world still mostly quiet, which gave them unusual clarity. A door opened, a bucket was lifted, ashes were stirred. A cock crowed again, now answered farther off. Someone coughed in a courtyard. A cartwheel, moved too soon, sounded louder than it would an hour later. In a town, an early bell might ring into streets still half held by darkness. None of these sounds were dramatic, yet together they marked one of the most delicate transitions in medieval life. The return of recognizable order. That return was never only practical. It was emotional. Morning meant more than light. It meant restored visibility, restored judgment, restored movement, restored witnesses. A problem that felt shapeless in darkness could now be examined. The path could be checked. The yard could be seen. The cause of the animal's distress could be found. The traveler could resume safely. The messenger could move without the same fear of losing the road. A sick room might still be full of worry, but daylight changed the quality of that worry because the world outside became available again. Medieval people did not simply prefer morning because it was brighter. They preferred it because it returned proportion to things. This is one of the strongest clues to why the night could feel so unsettling in the first place. Darkness did not necessarily create danger, but it enlarged uncertainty. Dawn did not necessarily solve danger, but it reduced uncertainty enough to make action possible. In that sense, the medieval night was governed not only by fear, but by the interruption of competence. Ordinary people were good at many things. Tending animals, navigating roads they knew, reading weather, repairing tools, cooking, bargaining, observing neighbors, maintaining households, judging materials, reading the condition of land. But darkness made all of those abilities less dependable. It placed even experienced people in a temporarily weaker relationship to their environment. Morning restored their usual skill. The crow of the rooster has been mocked often enough in later storytelling, but in a medieval setting it made practical sense as a powerful marker. It was not important because it was picturesque. It was important because the body and the household needed signs that the long interval of uncertainty was turning. Likewise, the first thin light in a shutter crack or under a door did not merely brighten a room. It proved that the world beyond the room was becoming legible again. That small return of legibility could bring an almost physical easing of tension. And still, pre-dawn had one more complication. It was the hour when dreams and waking could overlap most uneasily. In a world where segmented sleep, intermittent waking, prayer, worry, and physical discomfort were common, the boundary between sleeping perception and waking interpretation may have felt more porous than modern people assume. A person could wake from vivid dreaming into a still dark room and carry the emotional residue of the dream into the sounds of the house. A movement heard then might seem more charged than the same movement heard fully awake by day. This does not mean medieval people were uniquely governed by dreams, but it does mean that the hour before dawn, with its mingling of exhaustion and alertness, was particularly fertile ground for ambiguous experience. Religious culture gave that ambiguity language. Night visions, temptations, anxieties of conscience, spiritual struggle in the early hours, all these belonged naturally to a world where darkness had not yet fully loosened its hold. Monastic writings and devotional traditions often treated the early hours as morally serious not only because they were convenient for prayer, but because they placed the soul in a state of exposure. The body was tired, the house or cloister quiet, the world still dim, the mind less defended by habit and busyness. To rise and pray then was an act of discipline against the softness of sleep and the heaviness of the hour. Even outside religious life, that same exposure could make ordinary worries feel strangely absolute. This is worth lingering over because it gives the medieval night some of its deepest emotional texture. Many modern accounts focus on the external darkness. Poor lighting, dangerous roads, superstition, crime. All of that matters. But medieval nights were also unsettling because they left people alone with their thoughts more often, and under harsher conditions than many modern environments do. There was less distraction, less artificial light, less social extension into the late evening. Fewer devices, fewer diversions, fewer layers of managed comfort between a person and the fact of being awake at an unwanted hour. The night, therefore, became a setting in which inward life acquired unusual volume. For someone burdened by debt, a family problem, a failing harvest, a dangerous journey ahead, a sick child, or a troubled conscience, the quiet of the pre-dawn house could be severe. The day at least offered movement. One could work, speak, seek advice, observe, or postpone thought by attending to necessity. Before dawn, necessity had not quite resumed. The person lay there in the interval before action, listening to the house, to the weather, to the body, to memory. This is a profoundly human experience, and perhaps one reason the medieval night remains so easy to imagine once we slow down enough to enter it properly. At the same time, the pre-dawn interval could also feel unexpectedly intimate and even beautiful. This is important, because an unsettling world is not necessarily a world without gentleness. The same weak fire that cast uncertain light could also warm a room enough for comfort. The same shared bed or shared chamber that reduced privacy could increase security and tenderness. The first sound of someone rising to tend the hearth might be annoying on one morning and deeply reassuring on another. A monastery before dawn, cold and austere though it was, might also possess a stillness of extraordinary concentration. The first bird calls outside a village, heard after a long winter night, could feel like more than natural sound. They could feel like release, That tension between beauty and unease is one of the defining features of the whole subject. Medieval nights were so quiet and so unsettling, precisely because silence magnified everything that remained. Fear, prayer, weather, memory, labor, warmth, distance, companionship, and the smallest signs of the world returning. A brighter, louder world softens contrasts. The medieval night sharpened them, and once the first light arrived, it revealed something else that is easy to miss. Morning did not erase the night so much as expose what the night had been hiding or preserving. Frost on the threshold, tracks in mud, a loosened latch, a missing animal, a traveler at the gate, the weariness in a sick face after hours of unrest, the ordinary disorder of a poor room after a cold sleep, or sometimes, just as tellingly, nothing at all. The yard was ordinary. The strange sound had been wind. The anxiety had no visible cause. That too is part of the medieval experience. Many nights produced no revelation beyond the simple proof that fear had outrun fact. But that proof could only be established in daylight, and until it arrived, the uncertainty was real enough. In towns, dawn also brought accountability. Gates reopened. People emerged. Those who had moved through the night became visible again. Market life resumed. Work began. Rumor found new listeners. If something had happened in darkness, morning was when it entered community knowledge. A theft discovered at first light, a stranger noticed too early, a body found, an animal gone, smoke where there should be none, an urgent bell after dawn. These things became social facts only when witnesses could gather around them. In this sense, the medieval night was not only a time apart from society. It was also the period that produced questions society would answer the next morning. The contrast between night secrecy and morning disclosure could be especially sharp in legal and moral matters. Night concealed trespass, illicit meetings, smuggling, theft, or simple disobedience. Daylight invited inspection and judgment. That tension gave the night a special moral charge. To do something after dark was not automatically wrong, but it often meant acting outside the full visibility of the community. And visibility mattered enormously in medieval life. Reputation, trust, and local knowledge were forms of protection as real as walls. Darkness interrupted them. Dawn restored them. This is why the first people abroad in the morning often occupied a curious position. They were both ordinary workers and accidental witnesses. The woman fetching water, the servant sent to the yard, the baker already at work, the cleric on his way to the church, the watchman finishing his round. All these people encountered the remains of the night before the rest of the settlement had fully assembled. They saw the broken hinge, the tracks by the gate, the extinguished lantern, the unfamiliar horse, the weather's damage, the body in distress, the suspicious quiet where there should have been movement. Morning knowledge often began with them. And if we widen the view beyond settlements once more, the transition from night to dawn had another significance for those on the road. A traveler who had endured the darkness long enough to see the horizon lighten did not merely gain visibility. He regained confidence. Landmarks emerged slowly, first as shapes, then as places. The road, which during darkness had felt like an uncertain thread through emptiness, became a route again. Trees separated from one another. Water caught light. A distant church tower or smoke plume restored direction. Even fatigue could become more manageable because the world resumed answering the eye. This gradual return of the world must have been one of the quiet satisfactions of pre-modern life. Not dramatic sunrise as painted later for aesthetic effect, but the practical, almost humble recovery of orientation. One sees now where the ditch was. One sees how near the inn truly is. One sees that the figure ahead is harmless or not. One sees the bridge, the field edge, the path into the village, the reason the horse hesitated in the dark. Dawn restored explanation, but of course, once explanation returned, so did the full complexity of medieval society. The night had reduced life to narrower essentials: shelter, fire, sound, fear, prayer, waiting. Daylight reopened everything that darkness had temporarily compressed: hierarchy, work, law, trade, obligation, noise, conflict, gossip, and all the ordinary frictions of living among others. In that sense, the quiet of the night had a paradoxical purity to it. It was uncomfortable, sometimes frightening, but it clarified what mattered when most of the usual structures fell away. Perhaps that is part of why medieval nights have remained so compelling in memory and imagination. They reveal a world before artificial brightness flattened the meaning of darkness. They show what people do when the horizon vanishes, when sound carries farther than sight, when the household contracts around its weakest light, and when morning has not yet arrived to confirm whether the fear was justified. The unsettling quality of that world was real. So was its discipline. So was its intimacy. And as we move further into it, another layer begins to appear, because the medieval night was not only experienced by sleeping households, patrolling watchmen, anxious travelers, or praying monks. It was also shaped, in subtle but powerful ways, by the calendar itself, by feast days, fasting seasons, winter lengths, and the rituals that taught people when darkness meant ordinary danger and when it meant something more charged, more communal, and more sacred. Why feast days, fasting seasons, winter lengths, and the rituals that taught people when darkness meant ordinary danger and when it meant something more charged, more communal, and more sacred. This is where the medieval night becomes even more interesting, because it stops being only a natural condition and starts to look like something culturally arranged. Darkness was never just out there, waiting beyond the window. It was interpreted, divided, marked, and inhabited differently depending on the time of year and the expectations attached to it. A winter night in ordinary time did not feel quite the same as a winter night during Advent. A vigil before a great feast did not belong emotionally to the same category as an ordinary workday evening. The physical darkness might be similar, but the meaning of it could shift dramatically, and that shift affected how silence itself was heard. Advent is a good place to begin, because it reveals how fully medieval Christianity could work with darkness instead of merely resisting it. The long nights leading up to Christmas were not simply a meteorological inconvenience. They became part of a broader emotional and spiritual atmosphere. The year was turning inward. Light was scarce. Cold pressed harder against houses, churches, barns, and workshops. Roads could be worse, travel more difficult, the poor more vulnerable. And into that very season came rituals, sermons, prayers, and expectations built around waiting. Waiting for light, waiting for deliverance, waiting for the feast, waiting through literal darkness toward symbolic brightness. A modern person might think such symbolism sounds obvious, almost too neat, but in a world where winter darkness was bodily felt, it was not decorative. It was experiential. That gave medieval winter nights a layered quality. The quiet could still be uncomfortable, still expose shortages and fears, still make the cold seem endless. But it could also be given shape by collective anticipation. The church calendar did something subtle and powerful here. It did not remove the harshness of the season. It taught people how to endure it through shared meaning. The long night was no longer only a problem to survive. It was part of a story being lived together. Even for people who were not especially reflective by temperament, that mattered. Ritual can carry significance for those too tired to articulate it. The same could be said, in a different register, for the great liturgical nights of the year. Candlelight in a church during Easter observances, for example, would not have felt simply pretty in the modern sense. It would have stood out against a world that was usually much darker. A flame passed from one candle to another was not a minor visual detail. It was dramatic because light itself was dramatic. A community gathered in darkness to witness the gradual return of light would have experienced that transition physically, not merely symbolically. The silence before chant, the low murmur of prayer, the shadows moving against stone, the uncertain line between ritual space and surrounding night. All of this gave medieval sacred nights a distinctive power. And sacred power, importantly, did not always equal comfort. A vigil could be moving and unsettling at the same time. To remain awake in darkness for religious reasons was to take the night seriously rather than escape it. The body grew tired, the air cold, the hour strange. One stood inside a time when ordinary domestic life was partially suspended. But dawn had not yet arrived to return everyone to normal routine. This in-between quality made certain feast nights memorable precisely because they borrowed some of the unease of darkness and turned it toward devotion. Medieval religion was often strongest not when it eliminated discomfort, but when it gave discomfort a meaningful frame. This is one reason monasteries remain such important witnesses to medieval night. In monastic life, darkness was not an occasional interruption. It was a recurring element in a disciplined schedule. The night offices did not allow monks or nuns to treat sleep as a sealed private act. The bell broke into rest. The community rose. Silence had to be navigated collectively. One can imagine the familiar choreography of it. Wool blankets set aside, feet to cold floor, the faint light by which clothing was found, the movement through corridors whose shapes were known by repetition more than by vision, the gathering of voices in choir while the world outside remained unlit and mostly unknowable. None of this was easy, and it was not meant to be easy. That was part of its seriousness. What makes this particularly revealing is that monastic communities turned one of the most unsettling features of medieval life, enforced wakefulness in darkness, into a spiritual practice. They did not deny the body's reluctance. They built discipline through it. In that sense, the monastery offers a kind of concentrated model of the broader medieval relationship with night. One does not conquer darkness. One orders oneself within it. One accepts its limits, uses its quiet, and tries to keep fear, distraction, and bodily discomfort from ruling the mind entirely. Outside cloisters, ordinary laypeople could not imitate that level of structure, but they still lived by a calendar that made some nights heavier with expectation than others. Saints' vigils, Christmas Eve, the long austerity surrounding parts of Lent, local feasts, processions, nocturnal prayers in times of danger, all these shaped the emotional geography of darkness. A village night on the eve of a major feast might be quieter in one sense, because work was altered, but also more alive with anticipation. A church bell heard then did not mean exactly what it meant on an ordinary Tuesday. Likewise, darkness before a funeral, or on a night of public anxiety such as plague, famine, war, or regional unrest, carried meanings no household experienced in isolation. The night remained private inside the home, but it was also shared across the community through ritual, rumor, and common expectation. And expectation changes sound. This is one of the simplest but most telling truths in the whole subject. The same bell, the same wind, the same footstep, the same dog barking, the same movement around a church door can feel utterly different depending on what the listener thinks the night contains. On a feast eve, anticipation may soften the quiet. During unrest, the same quiet becomes watchful. During famine or epidemic, it may become heavy with dread. During wartime, darkness acquires another kind of tension altogether, because silence itself may be tactical, imposed, or broken by signs whose meaning is immediate. Medieval warfare is often imagined in daylight. Banners, cavalry, sieges, engines, battles in open view, but night mattered there too, and usually in ways more anxious than glorious. Camps at night were places of fatigue, suspicion, and imperfect control. Fires had to be watched, guards posted, horses kept ready, movements interpreted. A sound beyond the perimeter, a cry from the wrong direction, a delayed messenger, an unexpected light in the distance. Any of these could tighten a camp into alertness. The quiet outside a military encampment was not restful silence. It was space full of possible intent. Again, darkness did not create danger so much as multiply the difficulty of recognizing it in time. For besieged towns and castles, the night was often worse than the day in one specific way. It limited verification. During daylight one could at least observe enemy movement, damage, smoke, construction, the direction of attack. At night, the imagination had room to work on what sight could not settle. Are they digging? Moving engines? Approaching the wall? Setting fire somewhere unseen? Are those footsteps ordinary patrols or something more? The defenders, like all medieval listeners, had to live inside partial information. The unsettling character of the night came not simply from fear of attack, but from fear of misreading the silence before it. And then there is the village in troubled times, perhaps not under siege, but living near conflict, raiding, or political uncertainty. Here the medieval night becomes especially tense because the ordinary routines of enclosure, bar the door, bank the fire, listen for familiar sounds, sleep in the company of known people, begin to lose some of their protective force. A household may do everything it usually does and still know that the larger order beyond the door is unstable. In such conditions, quiet is not comforting. It is accusatory. It asks whether calm means safety or merely delay. The very stillness of the night becomes suspicious because it might be concealing movement just beyond one's hearing. This is where social trust becomes as important as walls. Medieval communities survived difficult nights partly because people knew who might help, who might warn them, who would hear a bell or cry and come, who could be relied upon, who could not. The night compressed these questions into practical urgency. A neighbor by day is one thing. A neighbor whose lantern appears when trouble begins is another. In that sense, night exposed the true infrastructure of medieval society. Not only stone, timber, locks, and rules, but relationships. The quiet could be tolerated more easily if one believed others were listening too. Yet relationships could also be a source of nighttime strain. In dense towns and larger households, the medieval night was never simply solitary. Quarrels carried through walls. Drunkenness could spill past the proper hour. Domestic tension did not politely respect curfew. A baby cried. A servant returned late. Someone coughed all night. Animals or apprentices disturbed sleep. What sounds peaceful to us in the abstract, shared housing, close communal life, compact streets, could be very trying in practice. Silence in the medieval night was therefore often relative. What mattered was not perfect absence of sound, but the reduction of general noise enough that each intrusion felt amplified. There is a striking irony here. Modern people are surrounded by so much background sound that silence has become a kind of luxury. Medieval people, by contrast, often had more genuine quiet in the larger sense, but less control over the particular sounds that entered their nights. They could not seal a room, equalize the temperature, regulate every disturbance, or mask one noise with another. If a sound happened, it arrived with full importance. One had to accept it, interpret it, or respond. This may be one reason medieval nights could feel so intimate and so raw. The acoustic environment was not customizable. It was encountered. That is also why local knowledge mattered with almost astonishing precision. People knew the ordinary voice of their environment. They knew how rain struck different roofs, how wind behaved in certain seasons, how a familiar horse stamped when impatient, how a gate sounded when properly shut, how foxes, dogs, owls, and livestock differed in darkness, how late returning drinkers sounded as opposed to strangers trying not to be heard. Such knowledge was not poetic ornament. It was a form of survival. Silence sharpened attention, and attention produced expertise. When a medieval person said that something did not sound right, that judgment may have rested on a lifetime of nocturnal listening. This restores some dignity to the subject. Too often, the medieval night is treated as a stage for ignorance, a time when confused people frighten themselves with shadows. But a quieter, more responsible interpretation is that the night demanded forms of competence modern infrastructure has partially outsourced for us. People learned to hear carefully because hearing carried consequence. They learned to prepare because delay could be costly. They learned to treat darkness with respect because it changed the reliability of the world around them. The unsettling quality of the night was not proof that they were foolish. It was proof that they understood the conditions under which they were living. The same applies to stories of omens, apparitions, and uncanny places. These tales are often repeated today with either mocking disbelief or romantic delight, but both reactions can miss something essential. The medieval imagination did not grow in a vacuum. It grew in a world where darkness genuinely obscured, where roads genuinely failed, where help was genuinely slower, where the dead were physically close in churchyards and memory, and where moral language saturated ordinary life. Under such conditions, it is not surprising that the night accumulated supernatural meanings. The surprising thing would be if it had not. Still, those meanings were rarely static. A quiet night near a church could feel holy to one person, haunted to another, merely cold and inconvenient to a third. The medieval world contained skeptics, warriors, dutiful believers, practical minds, storytellers, and those who shifted between all of these depending on the hour and the circumstance. One night a man might laugh at an old tale. Another night, walking the same lane late and alone, he might remember it differently. This flexibility is part of what makes the past feel alive. People were not categories. They were tired, alert, pious, doubtful, vulnerable, and often all at once. And vulnerability, perhaps more than fear, is the real thread running through the whole subject. Medieval nights were quiet because much of life withdrew from movement, light, and speech after dark. They were unsettling because withdrawal revealed how dependent human beings were on small securities. A known road, a neighbor awake nearby, a bar on the door, a banked fire, a bell in the distance, a saint invoked in uncertainty, a dog that barked at the right moment, the first gray line of dawn. Strip the world back to those things, and one begins to understand why darkness could feel so heavy without needing to be theatrical. This is also why the medieval night could never be only private. Even when a household seemed enclosed, it remained connected to wider systems, the church calendar, local custom, weather, political authority, agricultural labor, rumor, trade, danger, and belief. A candle burning low in one room belonged to a civilization that had arranged its whole rhythm around the reality that darkness was powerful. That civilization worked with the night, against it, through it, and within it, feared it, sanctified it, scheduled it, and listened through it. And in some of the most revealing moments of all, it gathered people together not despite the darkness, but because of it. Think of a vigil in a parish church while the village outside lies mostly still. Think of the low sound of prayer carrying in a building that is more shadow than light. Think of the cold pressing at the walls while wax burns slowly and familiar faces are only partly visible. Or think of a winter evening in a modest home, where the last tasks are done, the outside world has narrowed to blackness, and everyone knows there are many hours yet before morning. These scenes are different in status, mood, and meaning, but they share something fundamental. The night presses human beings closer to one another even as it reminds them of what lies beyond their control. And the closer we look, the more one final complication begins to emerge. Medieval nights were not only shaped by religion, season, and danger from outside. They were also shaped by the body itself, by sleep patterns, illness, age, childbirth, labor, exhaustion, hunger, cold, and the simple fact that night is experienced differently by the healthy, the frail, the young, the old, and the worried. Once we enter that bodily world, the silence of medieval nights becomes even more intimate and more revealing than before. Once we enter that bodily world, the silence of medieval nights becomes even more intimate and more revealing than before. It is very easy to speak about the medieval night as though it were a shared atmosphere that descended equally on everyone. But of course it was never that simple. The same darkness fell over village, monastery, manor, and town street, yet the body received that darkness differently depending on age, health, workload, hunger, grief, temperature, and expectation. A young laborer exhausted by harvest might sink into sleep with a heaviness that made the quiet almost irrelevant. An elderly person in pain might hear every movement of the house. A mother with an infant would inhabit the night differently from a monk in choir, and differently again from a watchman or a traveler forced to keep moving. If we want to understand why medieval nights could feel so quiet and so unsettling, we have to remember that silence is never experienced by the ear alone. It is filtered through the state of the body. That matters especially in a world where bodies were worked hard. Medieval life was physically demanding in a way that can be difficult to hold in view for long. Labor was close to subsistence. The seasons could press brutally. Nutrition was uneven, disease frequent, pain poorly relieved, and recovery uncertain. By nightfall, many people were not simply ready for bed in the mild modern sense. They were worn down. Their hands hurt, their backs hurt, their feet hurt, their clothing smelled of smoke, sweat, animals, damp, or labor. Their sleep, when it came, was often less a luxury than a necessary surrender. And yet bodily exhaustion does not always produce peaceful rest. Often it produces heavier breathing, awkward sleeping positions, restless turning, cramps, vivid dreams, or waking into discomfort before dawn. The quiet around such a body can feel severe. Cold made this worse, sometimes dramatically. We have touched on winter before, but the bodily experience of medieval cold deserves its own attention because it shaped the night so deeply. In a poorly heated room, warmth did not distribute evenly. It gathered close to the fire, disappeared in corners, and retreated quickly once embers died down. Bedding helped, shared bodies helped, enclosed bedsteads helped if one had access to them. But none of this erased the fact that many people slept in environments where the night kept pressing physically against them. Cold wakes people. It makes joints ache, breath visible, fingers stiff, sleep shallow. A quiet room in winter could therefore feel louder inside the body than outside it. One listened not only to the house, but to one's own discomfort. And cold had moral as well as physical consequences. A person who must rise from bed into a freezing room to check a noise, tend a fire, or answer a knock does not do so in a neutral state. Fatigue and reluctance shape perception. So does fear of losing precious warmth. This is one reason why nighttime interruptions could feel so heavy. To investigate meant exposing oneself not only to possible danger, but to the bodily misery of leaving whatever small pocket of comfort one had managed to preserve. In a modern heated house, that is easy to underestimate. In a medieval one, it mattered every night of the cold season. Heat could be difficult too, though in a different way. In summer, especially in close quarters, sleep could be broken by insects, stale air, smell, and the discomfort of bodies crowded together. Mosquitoes, fleas, lice, and bedbugs did not politely withdraw after dark. The medieval night was never as pure and still as later nostalgia sometimes paints it. Could itch, could stink, it could leave a person half awake, scratching, shifting, listening, resenting, and too tired to do much about it. Even animals contributed to this. A nearby stable, a yard, a pig enclosure, chickens roosting close to a house. All belong to the real sensory life of the night. Their sounds, smells, and disturbances formed part of the bodily environment in which medieval sleep had to occur. Illness made night heavier still. This is one of the most universally human parts of the story, and one of the saddest. Even now, sickness often seems worse at night. The body is tired, help feels farther away, and symptoms can appear to expand in the dark. In the medieval world, where medical intervention was limited and often uncertain, night could sharpen this helplessness. Fever in darkness is a different experience from fever by day. So is a child's cough, an old person's labored breathing, an injured limb that begins to throb when work has ceased and nothing remains to distract the mind from it. Silence can be merciless to pain. It allows every sensation to become proportionally larger. For the sick themselves, the night could feel endless. For those caring for them, it could feel suspended between duty and dread. A room where someone is ill at night has its own kind of soundscape. The careful movement of another person, a spoon, cloth in water, low voices, fire tended more often than usual, prayer murmured, sleep repeatedly interrupted. If the illness worsened, the quiet of the whole house could begin to organize itself around one bed. People listened for changes in breathing. They waited. They wondered whether to send for someone before dawn or hold on until light. In such moments, medieval silence was not empty at all. It was saturated with attention. Childbirth belongs to the same category of concentrated listening. A laboring woman did not experience the night as an abstract darkness but as duration, pain, uncertainty, and bodily effort. Those attending her, usually women with experience, relatives, neighbors, perhaps a midwife where available, would inhabit the same hours very differently from the rest of the household. Outside the chamber, night might still seem quiet. Inside, time was being measured by pain, breath, water, effort, and fear. The contrast between a mostly sleeping village and a single room alive with urgency is one of those deeply medieval scenes that reminds us how uneven the night always was. Silence on the outside could hide absolute intensity within. The body also shaped the night through age. Children and the elderly often had the least power over the conditions in which they slept, yet the most vulnerable relationship to them. A child might be frightened by darkness, separated from adults only by custom or sleeping arrangement, awakened by sounds he could not interpret. An older person, meanwhile, might sleep more lightly, wake more often, need to relieve himself or herself in difficult conditions, or be more sensitive to cold, pain, and anxiety. In households where generations lived close together, the night was therefore full of different thresholds of disturbance. One person slept through everything, another lay awake at every movement, another woke crying, another rose to quiet the rest. Medieval silence was collective, but never evenly distributed. Pregnancy, recovery from childbirth, chronic pain, injury, and disability all altered the meaning of darkness as well. A step that was merely awkward by day might be dangerous at night. A staircase, threshold, yard, or shared passage could become an obstacle once light failed. This meant that dependence became sharper after dark. People who needed help often needed it most precisely when movement was hardest and the household least ready. Night, in that sense, revealed the structure of care within a home. Who would rise? Who slept nearby? Who had authority? Who had patience? Who was too exhausted to help quickly? The silence of the night often concealed these questions until some bodily need forced them into action. Even healthy bodies were not simple. Hunger, for example, belongs more centrally to the medieval night than modern listeners may first realize. Not every household went to bed well fed. Seasonal scarcity, poverty, bad harvests, failed wages, or sheer inequality, could leave people hungry enough that the body refused the kind of settled sleep we like to imagine in a darker world. Hunger wakes, weakens, and narrows thought. It also changes the emotional weather of the night. A hungry household hears the quiet differently. Morning is not only relief from darkness, but a return to effort, search, labor, or hope for food. In that setting, silence is not contemplative. It is thin. There is a further irony here. Modern people often long for quiet, as though quiet is automatically restorative. But quiet without security can become oppressive very quickly. The medieval night teaches this again and again. The less buffered the body is by food, warmth, health, comfort, medicine, or confidence, the less soothing silence becomes. It stops feeling like peace and starts feeling like exposure. That is one reason medieval nights were so unsettling. Not because people lacked courage, but because the body itself could not be fully protected from the conditions around it. And yet human beings are endlessly adaptive. People found ways to make the body more manageable in darkness. Bedding was layered where possible. Bodies shared warmth. Enclosed beds, curtains, screens, and hangings reduced drafts in wealthier settings and sometimes in middling ones too. Nightclothes, caps, and blankets mattered. Straw, feathers, wool, linen, and whatever materials a household could afford shaped not only comfort but survival through long cold intervals. These domestic details can sound dull at first, but in fact they tell us a great deal about why the night felt as it did. A better bed did not make the night bright, but it could make it less hostile. A worse bed could leave every hour of darkness physically present. This is also where class enters the story with quiet force. The wealthy did not escape the medieval night, but they could negotiate it more successfully. Better glazing, thicker walls, more servants, better fireplaces, more candles, enclosed sleeping furniture, superior fabrics, and the ability to command help all soften darkness at the level of the body. That did not eliminate fear, but it changed how often fear had to share space with sheer discomfort. For the poor, by contrast, the unsettling nature of night was often intensified by material thinness. A worry sounds louder when one is hungry. A strange noise is more serious when the door is weak. Cold is more frightening when there is little fuel to spare. Silence was therefore not only a sensory condition. It was a social one. Monastic bodies, interestingly, occupy a category of their own. Monks and nuns often embraced discipline that made the body work against comfort on purpose. Rising in the night, fasting, limited bedding, cold dormitories, silence at set times, restricted speech, controlled diet, these were not accidents. They were ways of shaping the body into obedience, humility, and prayer. But precisely because monastic life disciplined the body so tightly, it offers especially clear evidence of how physically demanding the night could be. To wake for prayer in a cold stone environment, after broken sleep, in darkness or near darkness, and then return again to bed for only part of the remaining night was a strenuous pattern. The quiet of the cloister was holy, yes, but it was also bodily difficult. And bodily difficulty could produce spiritual intensity. This again is a contrast modern viewers often miss. We tend to imagine the spiritual and the physical as separate layers. In the medieval night, they were intimately joined. A person's awareness of weakness, pain, tiredness, and vulnerability often became part of the religious meaning of the hour. Night prayers were powerful partly because they were inconvenient. Silence seemed sacred partly because it was one against the body's reluctance. Even outside formal religion, the simple act of enduring the night through sickness, labor, worry, or weather had a moral texture. It asked for patience, restraint, hope, and practical steadiness. Dreaming deserves a little more attention here as well, because the body asleep was never entirely absent from medieval thought. Dreams could be treated lightly, gravely, suspiciously, or symbolically depending on context. But there is no question that night made the interior world harder to ignore. An exhausted laborer, a feverish child, a frightened pilgrim in a strange bed, a monk interrupted in sleep for prayer, a widow alone with grief. Each of these bodies would dream differently, and each might wake into darkness carrying some trace of what had passed through the mind. In a world where sleep was often interrupted and night not fully sealed off by artificial light and sound, dreams may have had more room to linger in waking consciousness. That lingering matters because the medieval night was so often a threshold between states rather than a solid block of unconsciousness. One drifted, woke, listened, turned, prayed, tended the body, adjusted bedding, responded to another person, then returned to rest if one could. The silence of the night, therefore, became a frame for repeated bodily negotiations. It was not a blank pause in history. It was part of life's working mechanism. Consider, too, the simple problem of needing to rise from bed. In a modern house, this is an inconvenience. In a medieval one, it could be a real trial. Darkness, cold floors, shared sleeping rooms, the risk of stumbling, the need to preserve modesty, the awkwardness of chamber pots, or the greater difficulty of going outside. All of this made the body's most ordinary needs more complicated after dark. This matters not because it is dramatic, but because it is intimate. History becomes more truthful when it includes the small indignities and calculations people lived with every night. The unsettling quality of darkness was built partly from these domestic frictions. The same applies to sound from the body itself. Snoring, coughing, muttering, teeth grinding, the breathing of the sick, the cries of infants, the complaints of the old, the soft conversations of those not yet asleep. In close quarters, these were unavoidable. Silence in such a setting was never total, but that did not make it less significant. It made it more human. The quiet of medieval nights was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence around fragile life, around bodies that could not be hidden from one another very well. And perhaps this is one of the deepest reasons the medieval night can still feel so emotionally close to us. Underneath the strange acoustics, the weak light, the curfews, the bells, the superstition, the ritual calendar, and the fear of roads or thieves, there remains something completely recognizable. People lying awake in darkness, aware of their own bodies and of those around them, waiting for sleep, waiting for news, waiting for pain to ease, waiting for labor to pass, waiting for the fire to hold, waiting for the child to settle, waiting for morning to explain whether the sound they heard mattered or not. That waiting is universal. It also suggests why nighttime memory could be so powerful. Daytime life passes in action. Night imprints itself in sensation. A person may forget a dozen ordinary afternoon tasks and remember clearly the cold of one winter night, the silence after a bell, the sound of hooves passing too late, the feel of getting up in darkness to tend the sick, or the relief of hearing the first movement of the house at dawn after lying awake for hours. Medieval people, like us, were shaped by such memories. And because their nights were darker and their sensory margins thinner, those memories may have had sharper edges. Once we see that, another shift becomes possible. We can stop imagining the medieval night as a single blanket of gloom covering passive people, and start seeing it as a field of bodily knowledge. People knew when a room was too cold for the baby. They knew how long the fire would hold. They knew which child woke from dreams, which animal signaled disturbance reliably, which elder would need help before dawn, which floorboard warned of movement, which season made coughs worse, which hour bred the heaviest despair, and which small acts could make darkness more bearable. The quiet of the night preserved all of that knowledge because it gave it consequence. And from there, the story begins to widen once again. Because once the body, the household, and the sacred calendar are all in view, we can start to see how the medieval night was also shaped by something even larger: the built environment itself. The design of houses, halls, streets, churches, walls, shutters, hearths, windows, and beds did not merely sit inside the night. They actively created the form that quiet took, and the form that fear, comfort, and wakefulness took along with it. The design of houses, halls, streets, churches, walls, shutters, hearths, windows, and beds did not merely sit inside the night. They actively created the form that quiet took, and the form that fear, comfort, and wakefulness took along with it. This is one of the most revealing turns in the story, because it reminds us that medieval darkness was never experienced in the abstract. It was always filtered through built space. A night in a timber house did not sound like a night in stone. A cottage with smoke-blackened rafters and a simple hearth did not feel like a chamber in a manor with thick walls, hangings, and enclosed beds. A narrow town street trapped sound differently from an open farmyard. A church nave gathered silence in one way, a stable in another. When we ask why medieval nights were so quiet and so unsettling, we are also asking how medieval spaces handled light, sound, warmth, and uncertainty. Take the medieval house at its most ordinary. For many people, home was not a series of private rooms arranged for individual comfort. It was a working structure in which domestic life, storage, labor, heat, animals, sleep, and social hierarchy often overlapped. By day, this overlap was busy and practical. By night, it became acoustically intimate. Every beam, latch, shutter, and floor surface had a voice. Timber contracted in the cold. Roof materials shifted in wind. Hearths settled as embers broke inward. Ash moved. Door bars creaked. A hanging pot might answer the movement of air almost too softly to notice in daylight, yet quite distinctly once the household had gone quiet. Medieval people did not live in mute boxes. They lived in structures that spoke continually in low tones once human voices fell away. That speech of the house mattered because it demanded interpretation. A familiar home was partly familiar because one knew its noises. One knew which creak belonged to cooling wood, which to a loosened board, which to wind pressing badly against a shutter, which to someone moving carefully through the room. This is another reason the night could be so unsettling. Built space trained people to listen closely, but that same training made irregularities harder to ignore. A house that made many ordinary sounds also made the unusual sounds stand out sharply. Silence, in other words, did not mean the house went silent. It meant its ordinary murmuring emerged more clearly, and with it the possibility that something outside the ordinary was now mixed in. Hearths stood at the center of this experience. They were sources of warmth, light, cooking, and company, but at night they also became measures of vulnerability. A strong fire made a room feel gathered and defensible. A dying one allowed cold and shadow to spread outward again. The moment when flames subsided and light became emberlight must have altered the emotional shape of countless evenings. A room looked different. Distances lengthened. Corners disappeared. Faces became less readable. If someone remained awake beside a banked fire, he or she occupied one of the most distinctively medieval visual environments imaginable. A half-dark interior in which the world existed in red glow, intermittent movement, and wide surrounding shadow. That half-dark environment was not always frightening, but it was rarely neutral. It encouraged a different kind of attention. The eye stopped claiming the whole room and learned to live with partial knowledge. Medieval people must have become expert in this, not because they admired ambience, but because daily life required it. Even so, the weakening of firelight near bedtime often seems to sit close to the heart of the subject. It is the moment when the house passes from being a place of work and speech into a place of sleep, waiting, and interpretation. The quiet deepens then not only because fewer people are talking, but because the architecture itself has shifted in what it reveals. Windows, too, deserve more notice than they usually receive. Many medieval houses had little glazing or glazing only in wealthier settings. Openings might be shuttered, covered, or simply small. This meant that the visual relation between inside and outside was often much more abrupt than in a modern home. By night, once shutters were closed, the outside world could vanish almost completely except as sound. The household no longer saw weather, movement, or neighbors with ease. It heard them instead. That transformed the whole meaning of external disturbance. A sound beyond the shutter carried more mystery because the shutter itself worked as a stronger visual barrier than a modern window does. Protected, yes, but it also concealed. This is one of the paradoxes running through medieval architecture at night. The very features that increased safety could also intensify unease. A thick door meant security, yet it made the knock upon it heavier. A shutter reduced wind and intrusion, yet it turned every outside sound into something unseen. A wall separated the family from the street, but it also forced listeners to infer what the street contained. Medieval buildings did not simply keep danger out. They defined danger as something just beyond the last visible threshold. Streets worked similarly. In daylight, a medieval street could be crowded, filthy, social, commercial, chaotic, and exhausting. At night, the same street became structurally different, almost a second place built from the absence of activity. Narrow lanes, overhanging upper stories in some towns, uneven paving, open drains, animals, refuse, and irregular building lines could all make darkness more oppressive. A broad modern street allows the eye to travel. A narrow medieval one, poorly lit or not lit at all, could feel enclosed even outdoors. Sound arrived strangely in such places. Footsteps might seem nearer than they were. Voices might be trapped and redirected. A watchman's call or a late argument might carry along walls. Town walls and gates contributed to this in a larger way. They turned the night into a matter of inside and outside on a civic scale. When gates shut, the whole settlement was redefined. Those within were enclosed together. Those without were placed into another category entirely. It is difficult to overstate the psychological force of that transformation. A town by day was porous, crossed by merchants, pilgrims, unnerving clarity. And because urban buildings stood so close together, one household could hear fragments of others without being able to see them. A baby crying nearby, a cart being moved, a quarrel muffled through timber and plaster, a drunk singing badly in the wrong hour, a door slammed with too much force. All of these became part of the urban night. The result was not always peaceful silence. It was something subtler, a reduction of general noise sharp enough that each remaining sound felt socially charged. Medieval urban quiet was therefore often tense rather than empty. It invited speculation. One listened not merely for danger. A narrow town street trapped sound differently from an open farmyard. A church nave gathered silence in one way, a stable in another. When we ask why medieval nights were so quiet and so unsettling, we are also asking how medieval spaces handled light, sound, warmth, and uncertainty. Take the medieval house at its most ordinary. For many people, home was not a series of private rooms arranged for individual comfort. It was a working structure in which domestic life, storage, labor, heat, animals, sleep, and social hierarchy often overlapped. By day, this overlap was busy and practical. By night, it became acoustically intimate. Every beam, latch, shutter, and floor surface had a voice. Timber contracted in the cold. Roof materials shifted in wind. Hearths settled as embers broke inward. Ash moved. Door bars creaked. A hanging pot might answer the movement of air almost too softly to notice in daylight, yet quite distinctly once the household had gone quiet. Medieval people did not live in mute boxes. They lived in structures that spoke continually in low tones once human voices fell away. That speech of the house mattered because it demanded interpretation. A familiar home was partly familiar because one knew its noises. One knew which creak belonged to cooling wood, which to a loosened board, which to wind pressing badly against a shutter, which to someone moving carefully through the room. This is another reason the night could be so unsettling. Built space trained people to listen closely, but that same training made irregularities harder to ignore. A house that made many ordinary sounds also made the unusual sounds stand out sharply. Silence, in other words, did not mean the house went silent. It meant its ordinary murmuring emerged more clearly, and with it the possibility that something outside the ordinary was now mixed in. Hearths stood at the center of this experience. They were sources of warmth, light, cooking, and company, but at night they also became measures of vulnerability. A strong fire made a room feel gathered and defensible. A dying one allowed cold and shadow to spread outward again. The moment when flames subsided and light became emberlight must have altered the emotional shape of countless evenings. A room looked different. Distances lengthened. Corners disappeared. Faces became less readable. If someone remained awake beside a banked fire, he or she occupied one of the most distinctively medieval visual environments imaginable. A half-dark interior in which the world existed in red glow, intermittent movement, and wide surrounding shadow. That half-dark environment was not always frightening, but it was rarely neutral. It encouraged a different kind of attention. The eye stopped claiming the whole room and learned to live with partial knowledge. Medieval people must have become expert in this, not because they admired ambience, but because daily life required it. Even so, the weakening of firelight near bedtime often seems to sit close to the heart of the subject. It is the moment when the house passes from being a place of work and speech into a place of sleep, waiting, and interpretation. The quiet deepens then not only because fewer people are talking, but because the architecture itself has shifted in what it reveals. Windows, too, deserve more notice than they usually receive. Many medieval houses had little glazing or glazing only in wealthier settings. Openings might be shuttered, covered, or simply small. This meant that the visual relation between inside and outside was often much more abrupt than in a modern home. By night, once shutters were closed, the outside world could vanish almost completely except as sound. The household no longer saw weather, movement, or neighbors with ease. It heard them instead. That transformed the whole meaning of external disturbance. A sound beyond the shutter carried more mystery because the shutter itself worked as a stronger visual barrier than a modern window does. Protected, yes, but it also concealed. This is one of the paradoxes running through medieval architecture at night. The very features that increase safety could also intensify unease. A thick door meant security, yet it made the knock upon it heavier. A shutter reduced wind and intrusion, yet it turned every outside sound into something unseen. A wall separated the family from the street, but it also forced listeners to infer what the street contained. Medieval buildings did not simply keep danger out. They defined danger as something just beyond the last visible threshold. Streets worked similarly. In daylight, a medieval street could be crowded, filthy, social, commercial, chaotic, and exhausting. At night, the same street became structurally different, almost a second place built from the absence of activity. Narrow lanes, overhanging upper stories in some towns, uneven paving, open drains, animals, refuse, and irregular building lines could all make darkness more oppressive. A broad modern street allows the eye to travel. A narrow medieval one, poorly lit or not lit at all, could feel enclosed even outdoors. Sound arrived strangely in such places. Footsteps might seem nearer than they were. Voices might be trapped and redirected. A watchman's call or a late argument might carry along walls. Town walls and gates contributed to this in a larger way. They turned the night into a matter of inside and outside on a civic scale. When gates shut, the whole settlement was redefined. Those within were enclosed together. Those without were placed into another category entirely. It is difficult to overstate the psychological force of that transformation. A town by day was porous, crossed by merchants, pilgrims, unnerving clarity. And because urban buildings stood so close together, one household could hear fragments of others without being able to see them. A baby crying nearby, a cart being moved, a quarrel muffled through timber and plaster, a drunk singing badly in the wrong hour, a door slammed with too much force. All of these became part of the urban night. The result was not always peaceful silence. It was something subtler, a reduction of general noise sharp enough that each remaining sound felt socially charged. Medieval urban quiet was therefore often tense rather than empty. It invited speculation. One listened not merely for danger, but for meaning. Town walls and gates contributed to this in a larger way. They turned the night into a matter of inside and outside on a civic scale. When gates shut, the whole settlement was redefined. Those within were enclosed together. Those without were placed into another category entirely. It is difficult to overstate the psychological force of that transformation. A town by day was porous, crossed by merchants, pilgrims, laborers, animals, news, and strangers. By night, once entry narrowed and movement slowed, the city or town became more like an extended household. The quiet after gate closure was not only practical. It was almost theatrical in its change of mood. Public life folded inward. The dark outside the wall became more distant and more menacing precisely because the wall made the community feel temporarily self-contained. Yet walls also produced anxiety. Someone arriving late, someone failing to return, someone calling for entry after the proper hour, someone moving near the gate from the wrong side. These situations made nighttime judgment harder and more consequential. Architecture, again, did not solve uncertainty, concentrated it. A gate did not eliminate danger from outside. It created a controlled point where danger, need, pleading, suspicion, and authority met in darkness. Churches shaped the medieval night in another, more profound register. A parish church or monastery church by daylight was a public and devotional space. By night, it could become something more emotionally charged. Large interiors hold darkness differently from houses. Stone absorbs and delays sound. High roofs make small noises feel isolated. Candlelight in a church does not simply illuminate. It dramatizes scale by leaving most of it unlit. Medieval people entering churches in darkness or near darkness were therefore entering spaces that made silence feel deeper than it did at home. A whispered prayer, a footstep on stone, the opening of a door, the first note of chant. All of these could seem suspended in an immense stillness. This must have been one reason nocturnal worship was so memorable. It was not only the religious content but the architecture that made it powerful. The body, already tired and perhaps cold, entered a space built to exceed ordinary domestic dimensions. Familiar details disappeared. One sensed columns, arches, screens, altars, relics, and shadows rather than fully seeing them. The quiet there was not the quiet of a sleeping house. It was the quiet of a place where human voices became small, that could comfort, humble, or unsettle, sometimes all at once. Beds themselves formed a kind of architecture within architecture. This is easy to miss because beds are often treated as mere furniture, but in the medieval night they were environments. A simple pallet, a shared mattress, a bench arrangement, or an enclosed bed with curtains created very different experiences of darkness. Curtains reduced drafts and offered some visual privacy, but they also narrowed the sleeper's world to cloth, breath, dim sound, and whatever little light remained. An enclosed bed might feel secure in winter and vaguely confining in another mood. A pallet on the floor placed the sleeper closer to drafts, insects, dirt, and the immediate sounds of others moving nearby. To lie in bed at night in the Middle Ages was therefore to occupy a highly structured relationship to sound and vulnerability. Class once again enters quietly but firmly here. Wealthier sleepers could buy not only softer materials, but more controlled night environments. Curtains, carved bedsteads, private chambers, hangings on walls, and servants who tended fires all changed how darkness felt. The poor rarely had the same degree of buffering. Their nights were more exposed to the house as a whole and to the world beyond it. This does not mean the wealthy were untouched by nocturnal unease, only that their architecture could muffle or redistribute it. For the poor, the night was more physically continuous with the rest of life. And then there is the stable, the barn, the byre, the workshop, buildings not primarily designed for sleep, but constantly involved in nighttime experience. A family worried about animals did not sleep in perfect separation from them. The architecture of rural life tied people to structures where living creatures shifted, breathed, stamped, and occasionally panicked. A sound from the byre at night could mean nothing or everything. It might be a restless cow, a fox, a thief, weather damage, or the first sign of some larger problem. The unsettling quality of the medieval night was strengthened by the fact that economically essential life, the animals, tools, stored grain, carts, and working materials on which survival depended, often lay just beyond the main sleeping space rather than in some distant secured facility. One slept close to one's livelihood, and therefore close to the noises that threatened it. Workshops in towns produced similar tensions. A baker's oven, a smith's tools, stored cloth, leather, barrels, or merchandise were vulnerable after dark in ways that mattered intensely to household economy. The architecture of work and dwelling was often intertwined. This meant the night did not simply threaten bodies. It threatened tools, raw materials, stock, and the means of next week's income. A strange smell, a draft carrying smoke, a suspicious creak from below, all might bring someone from bed not because of fear for life, but fear of loss. Again, architecture made the night meaningful by keeping survival close at hand and imperfectly secured. Even ruins and abandoned structures shaped the medieval imagination because architecture altered the character of darkness beyond active settlement. A roofless wall, a broken chapel, a deserted tower, a collapsed grange. These were not neutral objects in the night landscape. By day they might seem picturesque, useful, or merely inconvenient. By night they stored darkness in ways that the mind found difficult to leave alone. Gaps where windows had been, spaces where habitation once existed, half-seen walls interrupting moonlight. All of this gave abandoned architecture a strong place in story and fear. The unsettling power came partly from symbolism, of course, but partly from built form itself. Ruins created pockets of uncertain sound and shadow. They looked like places where something might still be present, even when nobody could say what. Bridges deserve mention too. A bridge at night is one of the most revealing medieval spaces because it combines engineering, vulnerability, and transition. Bridges concentrated movement by day and uncertainty by night. They narrowed passage, often sat near water whose sound obscured other sounds, and sometimes lay beyond easy help. A traveler crossing one after dark would know that architecture was helping him and exposing him at once. Without the bridge, no crossing. With it, a fixed point where danger could gather. It is no surprise that bridges entered medieval stories with such force. They were the kind of built threshold the night loved. Necessary, narrow, meaningful, and difficult to read under poor conditions. The same could be said of staircases, lofts, galleries, and passageways inside buildings. Modern lighting makes these seem ordinary. Medieval darkness restored their drama. A stair in weak light is no small matter. A passage between rooms becomes an acoustic corridor. A loft ladder or upper gallery magnifies the fear of falling, especially when tired. If someone moved there unexpectedly, the house itself became temporarily uncanny. The unsettling character of the medieval night often depended not on large dangers alone, but on these architectural interruptions that complicated movement just when the body was least ready to manage them. And all of this means that quiet itself was never a simple environmental fact. It was produced by walls, absorbed by cloth, redirected by stone, softened by straw, sharpened by narrow streets, broken by wood, and deepened by large interiors. A medieval person learned not only the sounds of the natural world, but the sounds of construction. Where an echo belonged, where a floor announced weight, where a hinge betrayed use, where a door stood slightly ill-fitted in wet weather, where a draft entered, where silence itself became suspicious because a usually noisy corner had gone still. The built environment trained the ear, and the ear in turn became part of how people inhabited architecture. This may be one of the strongest quiet truths hidden in the subject. Medieval nights were unsettling not because darkness made people irrational, but because darkness revealed how incomplete every human shelter remained. No house could fully master weather, sound, cold, theft, illness, memory, or fear. Architecture could narrow danger, distribute comfort, and define the inside against the outside, but it could not abolish uncertainty. That gap between protection and mastery, between having walls and still not knowing, lies very near the center of the medieval night. And yet the response to that gap was not despair. It was design, habit, and repetition. People built shutters because they mattered. They thickened walls where possible. They arranged beds for warmth. They kept tools near at hand. They enclosed courtyards, hung fabrics, repaired latches, placed animals strategically, banked fires carefully, and organized streets and gates according to rhythms of light and dark. In other words, the unsettling quiet of the night did not merely frighten medieval people. It taught them how to build. That in turn begins to change the scale of the story once more. Because if houses and streets were shaped by darkness, then so were entire settlements. Villages, towns, monasteries, castles, and ports all carried the mark of a civilization that expected the night to be quiet, difficult, and only partly governable. And once we begin to look at settlement itself through that lens, a larger pattern starts to emerge. One in which the medieval world arranged its communities not just for life by day, but for survival through long, uncertain nights. And once we begin to look at settlement itself through that lens, a larger pattern starts to emerge. One in which the medieval world arranged its communities not just for life by day, but for survival through long, uncertain nights. What at first seems like quiet begins to feel more like a kind of discipline. A shared agreement between people, space, and darkness about how to endure what could not be fully controlled. Because that is, in the end, what the medieval night reveals most clearly. Not simply fear, not simply silence, but limitation. A world in which human beings could build, organize, believe, and prepare, but never quite eliminate the fact that, once the light was gone, their understanding narrowed, their senses worked harder, and their safety depended on small, fragile systems holding together until morning. And yet, within that limitation, something else quietly developed. A different relationship to time, a different awareness of the body, a different attentiveness to sound, a different reliance on memory, on neighbors, on prayer, on routine, a different patience. Medieval nights were quiet because life withdrew from excess movement, light, and noise. But they were unsettling because that withdrawal exposed how much of existence depended on things that could not be seen clearly in the dark, and how much trust it took to rest anyway. To lie down in such a world was, in its own way, an act of acceptance. You closed the door. You banked the fire. You listened for what you could. And then, at some point, you chose to sleep, not because everything was safe, but because morning would come whether you watched for it or not. And perhaps that is the most enduring contrast between their world and ours. Today, we have pushed back the night with light, filled it with constant sound, and extended the day far beyond its natural limits. We have made darkness thinner, more manageable, more predictable. But in doing so, we have also lost something quieter. The deep, layered awareness that comes when the world grows still enough to reveal both its vulnerability and its structure. The medieval night did not allow people to forget those things. It reminded them, every evening, that beyond the reach of firelight and walls, there was always more uncertainty, more silence, more waiting. And within that silence, they learned how to listen. So as you settle in tonight, wherever you are in the world, you might notice how different your own night feels. How much of it is filled, softened, or explained before you even think to question it. And if you imagine, just for a moment, that all of that faded away, that the lights dimmed, the distant sounds disappeared, and the world beyond your walls became something you could hear but not fully see, you might begin to understand why medieval nights were not only quiet, but quietly, persistently unsettling. And if this kind of calm, immersive history is something you'd like to return to, you're always welcome here for the next story, the next night, and the next quiet corner of the past.